Thank you for joining us today. We are here to share the topic about the evolution of brand values. And this is a big topic. Well, for us, it's gotten even bigger once we realized that to answer that question, we have to understand the evolution of consumer values. How do we connect with the evolving values of Gen Z, and most importantly, beyond? It's challenging because we as a marketers led to believe that generations are different. Each generation comes with a new generational study, and we start from the point of differences, not similarities. And this creates an illusion of a massive value gap between generations. And to be honest, our history is long, 2,500 years long. What's wrong with the youth was a common topic of discussion among the ancient Greek philosophers. What you see in front of you is the quote from Aristotle. And the feeling is mutual. Younger generations are not necessarily the biggest fans of the older generation. Okay, boomers is the commonly used phrase today. In the 70s, we had an equivalent of that. Don't trust anyone over 30. But we're here to tell you that we are actually not that different. Yes, there's value gap between us and we are different, but we might not be as different as we think we are. In fact, we are all racing for greatness. Each generation, we pass down those altruistic universal values from one generation to another one, creating a cumulative impact and racing for greatness. To study this topic, we took Schwartz value model as the foundation of this report, but we altered it and made little changes to it as we start digging into secondary and primary research. Evolution of consumer values. So let me walk you through that. Ronald Inglehart was a famous American scientist. He was a professor who studied and dedicated his life to studying this very specific topic. And in about 1970s, he noticed a very interesting phenomenon where consumers start moving away from materialistic values to more post-materialistic values such as protection, freedom of speech, and gender equality. He specifically attributed this shift to urbanization, rise in higher education, and all of these factors contributed for us as humans, as consumers, to become more safer, more certain in our future. And that created the shift to post-materialistic values. However, when you look at data, you will notice that it's really not about 180-degree switch where we completely disregard materialistic values and start thinking about those higher altruistic values. No, it's more about reaching the new equilibrium where values of achievement become as important as post-materialistic values. So it's really reaching the new equilibrium. And you might be wondering when and how those values are starting to form. And we really start looking into this and we notice that those higher values, those core values are really formed at youth. Each generation, when they come out of age, we see a bump in cultural political movements that really help us form those higher values. For boomers, there was a lot about civil rights, feminist movement. Then Gen Xers switched to environmental crisis and environmental protection. And you can see different events followed millennials and Gen Z. And while the events are different, the values that they represent are very much the same. It's about helpfulness, universalism, social justice, benevolence, equality, and change. And you can also see that it's not a linear process because, again, when a new generation comes, they don't start from the same point as the previous generation. They pick up where the other generation has left off. And that is primarily driven by the I want mindset. Younger people, they have time and they have ambition to create a better world. They want to see the world, the better world for themselves, and for generations to come. Greta is a perfect example to represent that mentality. Her quote is filled with ambition. She envisions a more sustainable future for all of us. And she's inspiring all of us to take actions. Just think to yourself, when you were that age, what were your aspirations? What were you thinking about? And that forms our moral compass. So what you see in front of you in orange, those are the 4 high values that we identified as moral compass: benevolence, universalism, self-direction, and stimulation. And you can see subsequent values are kind of coming out of those 4 major values. Those are the values that we going to teach our kids, our grandkids, and that creates this intergenerational race to greatness. Wow, sounds great, right? Because so the world is becoming more altruistic. This is like straight out of fairy tale kind of a solution and situation. And humankind is becoming more selfless and violence is going to end. Just sounds like a perfect world, but is it? Well, you probably know the answer. I don't think I shocked you there. Yes, it's not a perfect world because we're not all monks. We live in the mainstream society. We're impacted by the events that are happening around us. And while we want to act on those high moral values as our guiding principle throughout life, we can't. Because over time, consumers become compromised. And our life priorities, what I need today, really changes my value priorities as well. And again, we kind of start following the same trajectory and start looking at different generations. And you can see the same boomers that were once fighting for human rights, over time, they switched to celebrating moon landing, dealing with energy crisis or Watergate scandal. And the same trajectory goes for Gen Xers and millennials. Again, the events are different, but values that they represent are very much similar. Power, recognition, achievement, we call those individualistic values. And you can kind of see with change of the inflection point really happens with the change of life stage, and that gives the rise to your individualistic values. You can also see that the dotted line kind of goes up and down and fluctuates, but it rarely goes as high as moral compass used to be in the earlier life stages. Because while we still have that moral compass inside of us, it's not the guiding principle for us. And that is driven by the I need mindset. Yes, we want those higher values, but at the same time, I need to make sure that my family is well off. I need to buy a house and I need to build my own self-image. Life is just becoming way too complex. And that shapes our individualistic values that are very important for all of us. We identified a number of them. It's achievement, power, conformity, safety, tradition, and headness. And those are the values that are very much dependent on the context around us. They tend to change as life moves on.
So to summarize here, we've created this value wheel just to help understand the differences between these individualistic values and the universal values. So these individualistic values, these are the ones that are I need based, and they're the ones that change based on the context of our lives. We'll represent them with this blue circle to represent the outer ring of our value wheel. And on the other hand, we have the universal values. So these are the values of I want. They're our moral compass. And you'll see them represented with this orange filled in circle. And as Anya mentioned, these are really the ones that are passed down through generations and help us close the value gap and ultimately bring generations closer together. And what we see here, we conducted some research that shows that generations are truly more aligned on these values of I want. We tested this theory about universal values closing the value gap, and our survey supported it. we actually asked respondents from each generation to rank how important each value was to them. We found that while each generation responds differently, you can see quite a bit of variety based on these age groups here represented by the different color blue bars. There is more alignment on universal values. So you'll see here on the next slide, there's actually only 10 points of difference on these values of I want, whereas the individualistic values differ by about plus or minus 30 points by generation. And this narrow spread ultimately means that our moral compass remains pretty strong generation to generation. Now, I'm sure what you're thinking, how does this apply to Gen Z? There's been so much talk about this generation recently. They are the most advanced, the most demanding, the tech savviest consumers we've ever seen. They're operating on an extremely high moral compass because of the point they are in their life stage. And also at a time where change just travels so fast and the context is so fast moving of our world today. All of this means that their expectations from brands are extraordinarily high.
So what? So what does this all mean for us as marketers? Well, consumers, those orange values that we were talking about, those moral compass, those universal values, we call them the values of I want. I want to create the perfect world. And by tapping to those values, we're able to build the brands of tomorrow, brands that are future looking and future proof. Why? Because those are the values that form at youth, so we can appeal to consumers early in their life stage. Those are the values that transcend the generations, because by appealing to those values, you can secure that you're not going to be just relevant to Gen Z today, but the future generations to come. It creates an emotional appeal and it improves the quality of life beyond the specific generation. On the same time, those outer ring values of individualistic values, or we call them the values of I need, they're also very important because they allow you to build the brands of today. They are, yes, they're short term because context changes rapidly. They depend on context, but they also allow you to build cultural relevancy today in the moment. And they help you to improve the quality of life stage of this specific generation. So while it is very tempting and very, it seems like easy to appeal to those immediate needs and immediate values of I need, we think that it is way more appealing and helps to create you a long-lasting connection, but by appealing to the unchanging man. Because once you appeal to those universal values, you can secure your long-lasting impact and long-lasting growth for your brand, no matter when throughout different times.
And so now that we've understood how these personal values change, let's just apply this thinking to brands and draw some conclusions that marketers can use. So there are really two ways to play this game. We're going to kind of talk about this, the two key different ways here that you can see indicated on the slide. Universal values, so those core moral compass values, we call those the riding the wave values. So that's where brands can appeal across generations and really future-proof their growth. The alternative comes in appealing to these individualistic values, which have more opportunistic appeal. And we call these catching the wave, which is more reliant on the culture of the moment. So while riding the wave really changes and evolves through generations, catching the wave really has these big moments in time that are relevant with particular generations or particular moments in our world. So we looked back in time and we actually found that ads of the past have actually been really focused on these individualistic values, things like health or power or achievement. So if we click to the next piece, you can kind of see how those apply to each of these brands. The context of the day is really everything here. And that's part of the reason that these ads can feel dated so quickly. But we wanted to find out how brands can really stay relevant across generations and not get lost to time. So today, there is much more of a balance between the I want and the I need values in these ads. So Nike is a great example of this. They've done it really well where they're balancing the culturally relevant values of I need with some moral compass values of I want. So you can see boxed in orange here, we have one ad from history, which is more about success and achievement, something that Nike has always been known for. But through time, we're also seeing they're adding some interesting values with self-direction and universalism in their messaging. So particularly the Colin Kaepernick campaign was very much about universalism, but we also see it in the way that they're featuring Serena or acknowledging individual self-direction in their campaigns too. So it is much more about this interesting balance. And in the research that we conducted, we also looked at how these values might apply to brands. And we found that some of the world's most relevant brands today are actually perceived as standing for both the moral compass values as well as these individualistic values. So the chart here on the right really shows how these brands are perceived. Orange being that moral compass value and blue showing more of those individualistic values. And so brands like Coca-Cola, Nike, Levi's really have this incredible balance that they've managed to achieve between the individual and the universal values. And so really this plus or minus 10 points, this is the brand area that we see them working really well. It's that equilibrium that Anya talked about, where we have these brands that can be relevant in the cultural context of the moment and across generations. Just like we saw people are moving towards an equilibrium of materialistic and post-materialistic values, we see their desire to connect with brands is really the same. So we'll see it in action here. We'll look at both scenarios. First off, we'll look at riding the wave, and then we'll look at catching the wave. So riding the wave in orange, oh, that's fine. So when we look at catching the wave, this is really about those individualistic values. And so Balenciaga is a really interesting brand that we've looked at here. Many brands take this approach, but it is much more of one where brands are tapping into trends or specific moments for cultural relevance. So consider things like their IKEA bag dupe or the Simpsons partnership that they had, or even their use of Kim Kardashian in a recent campaign. All of these efforts are appealing to these outer ring values. So power, achievement, hedonism, even conformity, when you look at the IKEA example. On the other hand, when you look at catching the wave, so this is, sorry, same hand. Catching the wave is really about building cultural relevance. It's a powerful, very splashy, attention-grabbing technique. And it can be achieved through partnerships, influencers, cultural activations, and brands like Balenciaga, as we saw, as well as Gap and Crocs have actually done this extremely well to build cultural relevance. And the thing is, it isn't long lasting. Whereas on the other hand, if we look at examples of catching the wave or riding the wave, we have Barbie, which is a great example. This is about reaching that equilibrium of the moral compass and the external values to appeal across generations through time. And so you can see on the left, Barbie was launched as a fashion toy, really heavily focused on these values of tradition and conformity. She represented this dream of being pretty and popular and fitting in, right? And as time went on, Barbie got jobs. She started standing for new things like achievements. You can start to see that moral compass growing. And she became a doctor. She represented these cultural aspirations of the day, like being a rock star or even being president. But you can see these values of self-direction kind of growing through time until we reach today, where Barbie represents the achievement of individual dreams. And so that balance of this outer ring and the inner circle allows many generations to connect with Barbie. It keeps her relevant for generations to come. And so riding the wave really builds that bridge to future relevancy. It can be done through service or product enhancement. It's not necessarily just about what you say in advertising or marketing. It's also about holistic innovation, whether that's in design or production or communication, as well as in response to big cultural watershed moments, like the presidential campaign, for example. And brands that are able to do this well can remain true to their brand core. So brands like Levi's and Google and IKEA do this exceptionally well. So our goal today is to help you understand how to be true to your brand core while balancing these individualistic and universal values to help ride the wave with Gen Z, as well as generations to come.
All right, so in this next section, we want to share some thought starters with you. How do you ride the wave with Gen Z? And as we already established, that universal values, they really help you to ride the wave and kind of create this catching, not necessarily catching the wave, but riding the wave and appealing through generations. But then then what should brands do, and how can you help brands to ride the wave while still maintaining your core? So on the right, what we did, we built the Gen Z value wheel. And as you can see, for orange is widely represented. It's very much activated because of the stage that they are today. At the same time, the outer ring, there are some blue activations as well. But for some of them, like traditionalism or conformity is not as active, and it's not the value of Gen Z. But if your brand stands for one of those values, it's okay, because you can always balance that established value of traditionalism and conformity and redefine it by applying those universal values. So let us show how you can do this.
So the first example we'll talk through is balancing with benevolence. So looking to balance with benevolence really means asking the question, what can brands do to put the needs of others first? Gen Z connects very much with several sub-values of benevolence, including meaning, friendship, respect, and loyalty. And so let's look at a brand that's done this really well. Tony's Chocolonely chocolate bars. They stand for hedonism. Who doesn't love a delicious bar of chocolate? But they've balanced that individualistic value with benevolence through their conversation bars. And those are ones that really are encouraging people to open up and have real conversations, with conversation starters printed right on the packaging.
So the next one is universalism. It's another very important value to Gen Z, defined by harmony, equality, nature, and broad-mindedness. How can a brand create more harmony and equality to appeal to this generation? So for this one, we use the example of Snapchat. Snapchat, it's no surprise for anyone, it stands for hedonism. This is what this brand does the best, right? It entertains us, it creates excitement into our life. But recently they balanced that value with universalism by adding a filter that allows people, their users, to study and learn American Sign Language. This was actually created by people who work for Snapchat with the hearing disabilities, to help create this great technology and make create inclusion for everyone. So this is a very interesting example where you don't compromise what you truly stand for, excitement, but then you can add this quality of universalism and celebrate many sides of inclusion.
Self-direction is the next one we'll talk about. And I love this example because it's such a hot point for Gen Z. Balancing out with this value can be done by asking the question, what can brands do to evolve perceptions and experiences and lean into things like creativity or freedom or self-determination? We'll look at an example where we're really talking about self-determination. And this one is from Adidas. They had a campaign called She Breaks Barriers, where they featured hijab-wearing athlete Asma El-Badawi, who convinced the International Basketball Federation to remove their ban on religious head coverings on courts. So they featured her in a series of short films, along with a number of other athletes, that show you really don't have to be an athlete in a traditional way. You can do so by keeping your religious values and really living them.
The next one, and it's the last value of the moral compass, is stimulation, which is very much defined by challenging, daring, and excitement. What can brands do to challenge the norm and lead the progress for all? So in this one, we use the example of McDonald's. McDonald's stands for traditionalism, right? We all know what to expect McDonald's. We know where to find them. But they have created a very recent campaign which really focuses on this value on stimulation. And and they really encourage their consumers to take out and act on a very positive action. Take away your takeaway is their slogan. And it's not just any takeaway. They talk about the trash and litter that their consumers might be creating. So this is a very interesting spin, and they stimulating and they encouraging their consumers to take on positive action. So we just spent this whole section talking about some thought starters and what other brands can do. But this is the thinking that you can apply for your brand. And we created this very fun exercise, which we call Spin the Wheel. So this exercise can help you to think about different ideas, places, events, channels, partnerships, and even packaging innovation that really allows you to tap into the values that you know today, those individual values of I needs, individualistic values, and balance them by tapping into the orange values of moral compass. What you can do, you can put your brand in the middle. Think about the values of moral compass that you want to add. Now think about the values that your brand stands for, because you don't want to change the foundation that your brand was built on. And now that outer gray ring, just spin it and think about different places, events, and even maybe talent that you can bring to your company. And what does that mean for you, for your brand, and Gen Z? So we started this presentation by sharing that we are, as generations, we are not that different. And we built this whole case to prove you that this is truly, we are not that different. And I think what's very exciting about this, that it really, for us as marketers, opens new opportunities, because we no longer have to think about in the moment and how do we connect with generations today, but more apply that thinking and start thinking, how do we connect with Gen Z today and beyond, making us all becoming brands of tomorrow. Thank you all for joining us today.